So for this one, there is going to be a trigger warning. But for the full version of this video with the audio uncut and the crime scene photos unblurred, just head on over to my YouTube. Now, I can't go into all the details, but I will on my YouTube break down these killers and their cases in much more detail separately. This is more of just a comparison of understanding. So we won't look at all the killings, just similarities and understanding how these things can play out in the real world. For example, Elliot Rodgers has a victim count of 7, but we'll be taking a look at only 3 of his victims. Danny.R has a victim count of 8, but we'll be looking at 5 of the victims in his case. And Brian Cohee, who has a victim count of 1. But it isn't just the victim count that we look into with Brian. It's the moments leading up to the murder that are explained by Brian Cohee. So over the past year, theories regarding the Idaho 4 murders have ranged from inside informants with an underground fight club style tunnel system that's connected the frat houses to just specifically that home, to the surviving roommates having involvement alongside the frat members, which wasn't realistically just a frat member. It was a family member to one of the victims arriving the morning of when the 911 call was placed. Cleanup crews because of a lack of blood outside the home, expecting the individual that entered the home to have leaked blood all over the inside of the home as well as on the outside. Reddit theories, YouTube channels and podcasts all talking about the what ifs. But what if we look at some previous crimes? Crimes that have already taken place with evidence that's already been released, to explain some issues some people have a hard time coming to terms with in understanding this case. So, for an example, it's been long said by many that Brian Cohee couldn't have killed the 4 on his own. They see the time frame too short and the victim count too high. People then agreed and continued with things like Brian Cohee's too small and too skinny, not knowing that Brian Cohee stands at 6 foot tall and weighs in at around about 185 pounds, whereas the mass murderer Elliot Rodgers weighs in at about 135 pounds and stands at just 5 foot 9 inches tall. Now, like the accused killer in the Idaho 4 case, Elliot Rodgers had that element of surprise on his side. And before Elliot Rodgers would go across the road and order himself a coffee, before uploading his retribution video to YouTube and emailing his manifesto about the carnage that he was about to ensue, Elliot stabbed to death 3 college students in his apartment, 2 of which were his roommates. The 3rd was actually someone that was unexpectedly to Elliot coming over to visit one of the roommates, only to be brought into the apartment where Elliot Rodgers would then stab him a total of 94 times. But it took Elliot Rodgers the element of surprise and 2 knives to kill 3 men without alerting any of his neighbours, then clean himself up to not alert anyone while out to go and order his coffee about the massacre that he was about to continue. Now, not a bulletproof comparisons of sorts, I know, but Elliot managed to kill all these individuals while they were alert and awake entering the home. The only difference was the element of surprise. The accused killer in the Idaho 4 case is accused of entering a home and attacking individuals that are in an intoxicated state. So the individuals in the Idaho 4 case already are at a less advantage with their guard down in being intoxicated and the fact that they're in their beds either trying to go to sleep or asleep. This then just gives a huge advantage to the perpetrator. But again, with people thinking that the time frame's too short and the victim count's too high, in the Idaho case there are 4 victims, which are not all separate. 2 are in one room and 2 are in another. So 4 victims in 2 rooms. The 2 victims on the 3rd floor are in a single bed together. So the attack doesn't become individual. The attack then becomes simultaneous, in which he attacks one and the other. Again, the victims in the Idaho 4 case had all been drinking that night, seen in CCTV and noted by a witness. So again, they're unaware with their guard down. Because really, why would they even have their guard up in the first place? They're young, it's a night out, it should be nothing out of the ordinary for them. But once in bed, the element of surprise becomes a huge factor and advantage to the perpetrator. They were drunk, fell asleep, and in that deep sleep potentially woke up for seconds to being attacked by a stranger with a K-bar. The reason why I say seconds there is because the body falls into a state of shock, and dependent on the areas of attack with the weapon used, like if stabbed in the heart for example, the body can go completely out cold in 4 to 8 seconds. If hit in the lungs, blood leaks into the lungs and you drown on your own blood, making it also hard to scream, shout or make any noise, as it would somewhat be like trying to shout underwater. Plus, in this mad commotion, the victim's first thoughts would be to try and figure out what's going on and move away, but because of the intoxication, a late night, and the element of surprise on the attacker's side, these individuals are likely completely and utterly defenseless, meaning that the attack was probably short-lived and very quick. So why wasn't there blood everywhere as one of the main things I see regarding this case? As if people expect this to be a sort of Kill Bill style of bleeding. So let's get into Danny.R and Brian Cohee, the accused killer in the Idaho 4 case. Many people have compared Brian Cohee to the likes of Ted Bundy and the BTK killer, but but to me, Brian Cohee is eerily similar to the serial killer Danny Rolling. Now, if you haven't already, I have done a video about Danny Rolling, as Danny Rolling, believe it or not, is so horrifying. The director, Kev Williamson, watched a documentary called The Gainesville Ripper about the serial killer Danny Rolling, and he was so horrified by what he saw, he wanted to create the same feeling of fear installed into him, but on paper, thus creating the Ghostface killer that we all know as Scream. So, pre-warning, Danny Rolling is horrific. So, some similarities between the accused killer in the Idaho 4 case and Danny Rolling. They believe that the accused killer in the Idaho 4 case left and entered through the back sliding door, and Danny Rolling used the back sliding door to enter the home of Krista Hoyt, killing her, as well as using the back sliding door in the home of Manny Taboda and Tracy Pauls to kill them as well. Both the accused killer in the Idaho 4 massacre and Danny Rolling used a K-bar to kill their victims, and both the Idaho 4 victims were too like Danny Rolling's, all students. Now, we have little to no evidence regarding the Idaho 4 case. We just have things prior to the gag order, then a PCA regarding Brian Cohee, and then the rest is just theory. But we do have evidence regarding Danny Rolling's case. And this is the interesting part here, because both killers used the exact same type of weapon. And there's crime scene photos regarding Danny Rolling's murders. Now, for obvious reasons, I cannot show you some. If you want to, you're gonna have to get digging yourself. But I can show you some. And in these photos contains the blood left from the attack of a K-bar, as well as blood stains left after an individual was stabbed and then dragged through the home. With Krista Hoyt's attack, Danny Rolling entered through the back sliding door using a screwdriver, but Krista wasn't in, so Danny actually waited until the next day for her to arrive home, and at 11 AM, Hoyt entered the apartment to be surprised by Rolling. Rolling would then place her in a chokehold. After she'd been subdued, he used duct tape to gag her mouth and bind her wrists together behind her back. Then he would lead her into the bedroom. Danny would then cut the clothes off from Krista's body and her. He would then force her to lay face down on the bed while he stabbed her in the back. He then flipped her body over and sliced her abdomen from her pubic bone all the way up to her breastbone. Then, after arriving back at campsite, Rolling couldn't find his wallet, thinking that he may have actually lost it at the murder scene, so he returned to the scene of the crime, at which time he then decapitated Hoyt, posed her body in a sitting position at the end of her bed, and placed her head on the bookshelf opposite, facing the corpse. He later claimed that his intent was to add to the shock of whomever discovered her, and I cannot lie, 10 out of 10 on delivery for that one. The thing is, considering that this horrendous and violent act took place inside her bedroom on her bed, there is a lot of blood, but in a controlled environment when the blood pertains to the room that it happened in. Not all outside of the house and so on, it's inside the room in which it took place. It's not even all over the floor or all over the carpets, which is important, as like this crime scene, the Idaho 4's crime scene early on by investigators was actually called a controlled crime scene, in which the blood from the victims mainly pertains to the rooms it happened inside of, which again is then similar to Danny's next victims, Manny Taboda and Tracy Pauls. Rolling broke into their apartment by prying open their back sliding glass doors using the same tools that he'd used before. Rolling would then find Taboda asleep in one of the bedrooms, where a struggle ensued between both the victim and Danny Rolling. Now, blood from Manny Taboda was found on the jeans that Danny Rolling wore the night the attack took place, and was later used against Danny Rolling as evidence. But again, considering these two individuals fought, and like the other victims, Manny Taboda was also stabbed multiple times in the back, Danny Rolling wasn't exactly covered like the people expect the accused killer in the Idaho 4 case to be. Merely stains and droplets of blood that was found on his jeans would be later used against him. Whereas for some reason people expect in the Idaho 4 case the killer to be drenched head to toe in blood. Even though a witness in the Idaho 4 case claimed that the individual she saw leaving the home that night was dressed in clad black clothing. Investigators too later on apprehended receipts. These receipts have been seen to have been something regarding Dickies. Dickies do boiler suits and so on. If the individual is a criminologist like Brian Cohee and understands certain fabrics and things like nylon and waterproof things that Dickies actually make, and the individual was wearing something like that over the top of other clothing for the attack, as well as the fact that these individuals are all laying down in their bed, and when you're laying down in your bed you're usually underneath your duvet or your sheet, giving the attacker literally a sheet of protection as he attacks these individuals, whereas Danny Rolling and Manny Taboda actually fought. But Manny isn't the only victim in this spree of Danny's. Hearing the commotion, Tracy Pauls went down the hallway to Manny Taboda's bedroom where she would see Danny Rolling. She actually ran and attempted to barricade herself inside of her bedroom, but Danny Rolling would manage to break through the door. Rolling taped both her mouth and wrists, cut off her clothing, and her before turning her over and stabbing her 3 times in the back. Rowling then posed Tracy Paul's body, but left Manny Taboda's in the same position in which he died. Which is interesting, as investigators in Danny Rolling's case believe that all of his victims were meant to be female, because Danny Rowling posed every single female victim that he killed. In total, Danny Rowling killed 8 people, 3 of which were male and 5 were female. But Danny Rowling posed the body of every single female, and left every male body untouched, which is eerie as the body of Ethan Chapin in the Idaho 4 case is mentioned as died from sharp wounds, indicating more so that Ethan Chapin's wounds are that of a fatal puncture, so merely just stabbed and left. Whereas they kind of suggested that the females in the Idaho 4 case are more so slaughtered and stabbed multiple times, viciously, as opposed to sharp wounds like Ethan Chapin, suggesting maybe too that the accused killer in the Idaho 4 case's victims were all too meant to be female. But again, in the crime scene photos of Manny Taboda and Tracy Paul's, considering what took place inside that home, using the same type of weapon, with them being killed in a similar place, all being their beds, blood kind of stays in the areas in which it took place in. Not necessarily like all over the walls and ceiling. I'd suggest that because of how they've said that Kaylee was found, there probably is blood on the walls of Madison Mogen's room. As well as not only that, in a PCA they've suggested that Xana Kernodle's body was found on the floor, as that's what a police officer said that he saw when he first entered the home and went upstairs. Some people have said that Ethan Chapin was in the hallway. Ethan Chapin was not in the hallway. Ethan Chapin was in the bed in Xana Kernodle's room. And one of the ways that we know this is because on the outside of the home, we actually see blood trailing down the wall. And because of the fact that Xana Kernodle was found on the floor, and they've suggested that Ethan Chapin was in the room, on the bed, the blood is more than likely that of Ethan Chapin's that is on the wall and seeped through onto the outside of the home. Not only that, but in another one of Danny Rowling's crimes when entering the home, he found Christina Powell asleep on the sofa downstairs. And instead of waking her up, Danny Rowling chose to go upstairs, where Sonia Larson was also asleep. Rowling then murdered Larson, first taping her mouth shut to stifle her screams, and then, like the others, stabbing her to death with a K-bar knife. And Sonia Larson, like Xana Kernodle, died trying to fend him off. Now we have a suggestion that Xana Kernodle is somewhat awake, because Xana Kernodle left a comment on one of her friend's TikTok accounts, and this was roughly around 4:10 AM. Not only that, but Xana Kernodle had also received a DoorDash at roughly around 4 AM. And with these two things in mind, it's more than likely that Xana Kernodle was awake when Brian Kohberger entered the home. But Sonia Larson died trying to fend him off. And during this attack merely upstairs, Christina, asleep downstairs, heard nothing that caused concern for alarm that would wake her up to whatever was going on upstairs. And because of this, she remained asleep. But Rowling would then go back downstairs, where he would tape Christina Powell's mouth shut, bound her wrists together behind her back, and threatened her with the knife as he cut her clothes off. He then her and faced her face down onto the floor, where he then stabbed her 5 times in the back with a K-bar knife. And again, blood doesn't exactly trail all over the house. In fact, it doesn't really cover it at all. Again, it actually remains in the spots in which it took place, on the sofa and in the bed. With the other factor being that the soon-to-become victim in that case, Christina Powell, isn't awoken to the sound of Sonia Larson being murdered upstairs. She's actually only awoken when Danny Rowling makes his presence known. Now the comparison here is the knife used and the crime scene photos that were made public, where it kind of gives a little more understanding when looking at the Idaho 4 case. All the victims, like Danny's, were in bed. The victims in the Idaho 4 case, though, were intoxicated, whereas Danny's were not. But with each of the victims laying down, your blood circulation is actually different. Blood actually pulls into the legs. Lower volumes of blood are actually pumped through the body, even though the heart works harder. Oxygen is reduced and the risk of blood clots increases, particularly in the legs and lung. Whereas it's very different in other cases where people are stabbed, with them being somewhat potentially awake, somewhat being alert, like with Elliot Rodgers, for example. The victims in that case were awake when they were entering the apartment, so Elliot Rodgers has the element of surprise, but with these individuals moving around, blood is technically pumping around the body, and Elliot Rodgers, after murdering 3 people in his apartment, managed to clean himself up enough to go across the road and order himself coffee. Difference is, though, is that Elliot Rodgers had an end goal in his plan, whereas Elliot Rodgers wanted to take himself out after taking as many people as possible with him. So Elliot Rodgers didn't exactly need to care about cleaning up in his case. And in the Elliot Rodgers case, blood was only found in the building's hallway because they believed that Elliot Rodgers actually attacked them as they entered the apartment. So again, majority of the blood is inside of Elliot Rodgers' apartment, but some of it is outside and in the hallway because that's where Elliot attacked them. Not necessarily because Elliot dripped it all over the house. And again, the difference here being is that Elliot Rodgers had an end goal. And if the accused killer like Brian Kohberger has an end goal, his is very different to Elliot Rodgers. Brian Cohee is to then get away with the case he's being accused of, where there's a potential that the individual in the Idaho 4 case used 2 layers of clothing. And if he did, and one of the layers of clothing was a Dickies suit, most of these Dickies boiler suits can come water resistant or waterproof. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to completely block any water or anything that gets onto them, but it does mean that they're going to have a resistance in things that gets onto them. Meaning that if the accused killer in the Idaho 4 case attacks these individuals, gets out of a Dickies boiler suit into black clothing that's already on underneath, holds the K-bar knife and places the Dickies boiler suit over his hand and simply walks out of the home, this could explain why the witness never saw the massive knife that the individual used that night, and only saw him in clad black clothing with one of the COVID type masks on. But with them being in bed, it's likely that the duvet covers the victims in the Idaho 4 case as some kind of layer of protection, and not necessarily for them, but for the person that's actually attacking them, because this then creates a sheet between the victims and the attacker, which would explain why they called Idaho 4's crime scene bloody, but a controlled crime scene, meaning that the attack in itself was bloody, but the blood mainly remains inside of the rooms in which it took place, similar to that of the Gainesville Ripper. Now, for the next part of this, we take a look at Brian Cohee and what he said during his interrogation that could explain what the killer too thought that night driving around Idaho before entering the home. But if you enjoyed that and you want to see the next part, then be sure to follow or subscribe to keep updated with everything related to true crime. But that's it for now, so I hope you enjoyed and have a good week.